All right. Might as well get started. It looks like we're all about here. My name is Adam Pizzoni. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Yammer. Now, of course, part of Microsoft. Yammer's part of what's called ASG, the Application Services Group, which is where Office is. I want to make sure you all know you're in the right place. You're in the executive track, which means we're going to talk about executive-y stuff. It's exciting. We're not going to talk about technology deeply, but it's all about technology, of course. But you're not going to see me necessarily do demos or talk about upcoming features. We're going to talk about something just as important. Hopefully, I just wanted to warn you about that ahead of time. During the keynote, there was a bunch of discussion about the impact of technology in our lives and just what a radical transformation it's been. And in fact, we were just at a lunch where I made the comment, even as I was listening to Bill Clinton, I was thinking about how, for most of us, we are extraordinarily lucky that we got into technology early enough that this is a part of what we do, that we're part of the lucky few that gets to lead this revolution that's changing the entire world. And yet, even though we're so lucky, and even though if we go back a decade, most of us were using technology to really accelerate our companies ahead of our competitors and suddenly it feels like technology has gotten ahead of us. Suddenly the same technology that we in business were driving is what's driving our customers to change their expectations of us faster than we can respond. And that is a little bit of what I want to talk to today. The forces behind that, what is driving this pace of change, and how companies are responding to handle them. So first I want to ask a quick question. How many people here received over 100 emails this week? That is all right. Keep your hand up, if you also received a handwritten letter this week. Let's see. Oh, there's one. Yeah. Faith? Really? Good job. I know her. No. The way that we get, receive, send information, communicate has changed completely in our lifetime. You didn't get emails 15 years ago, 20 years ago. It's completely different than it ever was. How many people remember when Kate Middleton was having her baby and the discussion that was going on online about what the name of the baby would be, when it would be born, what the gender would be, and once that information was available, everybody knew about it instantly. Or on a more serious note, let's see if my clicker works, there was the horrible tragedy in Japan with the tsunami and the earthquake. The world was able to watch those events in real time, lend aid in real time, communicate with people that were there. Whether you use Facebook or Twitter, you found out about those events because of them. In a prior presentation, I talked about the Boston bombing and how the police were using Twitter to try to find the suspects. The communities formed online that were doing their own forensics to try to figure out what was going on. So what is all this? What's changed? Well, what happened was, in the last decade, the world formed a giant network where information is available instantly to everybody, where you can go on a moment's notice to find anything you want, to connect with people that can help you do anything you need, creating communities around literally everything. To understand this, and of course this explains this great mystery that we've all probably had, which is, why is the pace of change accelerating, if it is at all? I mean, if you go back to the 1980s, you would probably see business books that talked about the pace of change and how you have to accelerate your business and be agile. So is there something different today, or is it just business as usual and change has always been a thing? Something is special today. You see, information is what drives change. When you learn a new piece of information, something novel, you change. You personally change. When you learn about a new product or service or offering, a way of delivering it, it changes your expectations of the world around you. I was thinking back to when I grew up. I was a child of the 80s. And I was just asking myself, how often in my life did I encounter new and novel information? And I was remembering back to being in school in third grade, watching when the Challenger space shuttle went up, and of course that horrible tragedy. And I remember for the first time in my life realizing that I was part of a global community, watching this in real time. The whole world was watching this event in real time. That happened a few times in that decade. Today that happens every day. Every day when events happen, good or bad, whether it's Kate Middleton having a baby or what's happening in the Ukraine right now, as President Clinton talked about, we are a part of that in real time, and that changes us because the pace of information drives the pace of change. And to understand this, we can see really clearly these inflection points in history when we had new modes of communication that drove unbelievable increases in the pace of change. You can imagine, before the printing press, how would new information come about? I watched this show recently that talked about how part of why Britain ended up coming up so big after the Dark Ages was people went to, I think it was the south of Spain, and found these libraries, and they physically carried the books back, and it created an explosion of information. But it required people physically carrying and finding books that were handwritten. Suddenly, because of the printing press, you could instantly take information and pass it everywhere. Immediately after the printing press was invented, propaganda was invented. And instantly, people could convince wide audiences about a concept or topic. And then after that, you have the telegraph. You can instantly communicate with people over long distances. And then the telephone. And even before the telephone, you had the Xerox copier. Suddenly, you could take paper, copy it, and give copies of it all around. These accelerated change, those moments in history. And then finally, we get to the telephone, when I can now call someone anywhere in the world and tell them something that changes them. And then email, when I could send one message that could go to thousands of people, and the internet to go to thousands of people. But then something really interesting happened just in the last 10 years. All of that publishing became democratized. Anybody could publish anything, and information travels instantly. And that means change is happening faster than ever before. Well, here's the problem. While this revolution was going on in our personal lives, where we can get any information we want, we can talk to anyone at any time, companies really haven't changed or evolved since they were first designed for the Industrial Revolution. And designed for an era that didn't change that quickly. Designed for an era when the most important thing was efficiency. And in fact, a lot of the things we believed back then, when we created the companies that we think about today, we don't believe today. Back then, there was a guy named Frederick Taylor who invented scientific management, the basis of all the companies you work at today. And he believed that there was only one right way to do anything, and that most employees were too dim to figure it out on their own, which is why we needed two classes of people in companies, thinkers and doers. And the thinkers were a small percentage of the people. Well, I'm guessing most of the people here don't believe that today. And yet so many of our communication structures and the way we run companies is still based on those ideas. Which is why it's not hard to understand why we have so many problems dealing with the worlds that exist today. And to show you just how radical a change this has been, this is a Gartner study that they've been doing for a little while now on routine versus non-routine work in enterprises. Routine work is work that does not require creativity or judgment or self-direction. Non-routine work, again, requires creativity, self-routine, and direction. And what they found was that there has been an explosion in the past 5 years even in the amount of non-routine work in business. And if you go back to the 1900s, again, most of the companies were manufacturing companies. Most of the people were doing routine jobs. You would do the same thing over and over. It was easy to judge you on how quickly you did it, how closely you followed the instructions. And suddenly, we find ourselves in a world where within just a couple of years, the majority of the work, the majority of the employees are going to be in positions that are non-routine, where you cannot give them specific instructions because it will require judgment and creativity. Now, I want to talk about something I think is hidden in this slide that impacts everybody in this specific room. What happened? Why is it that there was a sudden, dramatic increase in non-routine work? Well, going back to the beginning where we talked about how we were using technology to drive our companies, and now suddenly we're running to keep up with it. What I think this slide shows us is that in the last 20 to 30 years, we were primarily using technology within our companies to automate things, to automate away routine work. Now, it doesn't always look that way. When we think of automation, you may think of robots or machines, but you also think about the steno pool that went away once we could type our own messages. You think about all of the business processes that we put online. You have a ticket tracking system that used to be done by hand. So we were spending all this energy and very successfully automating away all of this work. But what's left is a whole bunch of non-routine work that is difficult to automate. What's left are a bunch of problems that are very difficult to solve with technology alone. So I don't know if you felt this way, but I've seen among our customers and myself that sometimes it feels like we don't get the same returns out of technology alone that we used to. that we'll purchase technology and buy it and roll it out, and then sometimes it just doesn't have the impact we thought it was. Because again, we're used to a world with low-hanging fruit, where there was all this stuff to automate, you could roll out technology and get immediate gains. But something has happened that has changed that environment. Well, here's my illustration that I think perfectly sums up what the problem is. And to actually illustrate this point, we're going to talk about customer service for a moment. How many people here have called their cable service company or their cable company to ask for, there was a billing problem or a service problem? Probably the majority. And if you're like me, it's probably the case that the person who answered the phone didn't have the answer. In fact, I can't remember the last time I called customer service and the person had the answer. It's almost like, why do they have this position, this whole class of workers that doesn't know any answers? Well, it's partially because those people used to run off of these, run books and databases that had all the answers. But the world's changing too quickly. They can't have all the answers anymore. Well, somewhere in that company that you spoke to, there was a person with the answer. But the person you spoke to had no connection to them, no way of communicating with them. Now, you can understand why that's a problem. But today, it's more than just that. What if your call represented a shift in customer demand or signaling of some larger problem, and that there was a whole group within the company that would be interested to know that? Maybe the CEO themselves would want to know about this change that would have an impact on the future of their business. Well, there's no way for them to get that information. Companies weren't built to share. They weren't built to share information, to adapt, to deal with this influx of information. They were built to be stable and consistent and efficient. But here is what happened. The world formed a giant network where people in our personal lives can find anything we need at any time. But when that information hits companies, it gets stuck. It is unable to move and adapt. And this is really illustrates two problems. One, as an employee, it is so frustrating to know that when I walk outside the office, I can instantly do anything. I can find all the information I need. But when I get to work, where is it? I can't find anything. I don't know who can help me. That's problem one. Problem two is, because of the way information travels, people are changing their expectations of the companies that serve them faster than those companies can respond. And not just companies, organizations. This is about schools and governments, nonprofits, and companies. The world formed a giant network, but companies remained rigid hierarchies. And this helps explain why we have this epidemic problem of employee engagement. 87% of global workers say they're disengaged at work. They're not interested in helping anymore because they've already checked out. And why are they checked out? Again, they don't understand why they have these incredible tools and information at home, and yet at work are in the dark ages. And furthermore, as we saw on that chart on the rise of non-routine work, so many of those employees find themselves encountering new challenges every day that they're ill-equipped or unempowered to handle. And that's what leaves them disillusioned and disengaged. And so how have companies responded primarily to these problems? They've pushed their employees harder. They've tried to just make their whole organization more productive without changing the way they work. And that has been very effective. In the last 40 years, according to the Deloitte Shift Index, productivity has been on a steady rise. But in that same period, return on assets, which is a key measure of performance, has been declining the entire time. We've been working harder and harder, but for less and less return, which should show us that we're working on the wrong things. And what I think this really shows us is that as the pace of change has increased, our company performance has decreased. Our companies weren't built for this pace of change. And what happens when you continue to try to run companies the old way in this new environment? Disruption. You see, disruption happens when your customers outpace you. Disruption happens when somebody else figures out how to provide the value that you're providing, so different from you, you couldn't catch up because you weren't responding fast enough to your customers. Your customers are outpacing you. I think this quote from Jack Welch actually perfectly sums it up. It says, if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. Okay, so this has been a little bit of a downer up until now. I've been talking about all these changes, and it's really rough. That's really rough, I understand. But it is not all bad news. You see, this pace of change that we're dealing with today, it's not different for you or the person around you. It's literally the same for every company in this room. the same. And that means it is still a level playing field. And furthermore, because we are just beginning this major inflection in how companies work, there is a greater opportunity now to compete than almost ever before. In the same way that we were able to use technology to jolt ahead of our competitors, we're now going to be changing the way we work to do the same, to be able to take advantage of the technology that we have. Because again, it is a level playing field. And so you can use the pace of change to your advantage. So when we looked across all of the companies, and all of the writers, and all of what people were saying about our current environment and how things were changing, we realized that they were all beginning to speak a similar language, that they were all beginning to speak about the same changes, even if they were using different words. And so we wanted to sum up what were these big shifts that we were seeing. And so we created this idea of the responsive organization, which is essentially just a way to talk about these changes and to connect with other people who see them as well, so that we can look at companies to understand how they're dealing with the pace of change and learn from them. So what is a responsive organization? Well, if a classic company was really just about efficiency, a responsive organization is about how quickly you can learn and respond to new information. And how do you do that? By encouraging open information flow through experimentation, decreasing the cost of failure, learning on rapid cycles, and working like a network with your employees, customers, and partners. Now that concept, working like a network, is one we heard about in the keynote, but you're going to hear a lot about today and in the years to come. Because again, our fundamental disconnect between our organizations and the world around us is that the world formed a giant network. So let me first run and give you an example of what I think is a responsive organization. Zara is a clothing company. How many people here have heard of Zara? Probably it's a lot of people. Okay. Now, imagine for a moment that you were going to start a fashion company, though I don't recommend many people here start fashion companies. No, I'm just kidding. So imagine you were going to start a fashion company. You'd open your company handbook and you'd create a division for manufacturing and one for design and retail and distribution. And a new product would start in design, and the design team would create it. And when it was perfect, they'd hand it off to just manufacturing, and they would create it. That process would take a long time. That is how most fashion companies work today. Well, Zara realized something. Because of information technology, they could get fast feedback on how their products were doing. And so they wondered how they could take advantage of that. Well, instead of organizing the way that I just described, they take a single garment and they organize people from around the company around that garment. And they make them a cross-functional team and say, you guys are dedicated to that until it's complete. In that way, they can innovate across organizational boundaries. They don't have to worry about whose manager said what. And in that way, they can get a new garment from design to the store shelf in under 15 days. It revolutionizes the industry. Now, listening to that, you might think, oh, I get it. They can get more products to market. That's not what's interesting about this. What's interesting about decreasing the cycle time is that they have decreased the cost of experimentation, of failure, so they can increase their rate of experimentation, which means, and this is true, they can go to a frontline retail worker, a low-paid frontline retail worker, and say, if 3 customers in a week ask for a red jacket and we don't have it, you can tell us, and we'll listen, because within 2 weeks, we can have a small batch of red jackets, and if they sell well, we can expand quickly. They can quickly move their resources from things that don't work to things that do. And they can engage their employees in new ways, because those employees can offer feedback that can be responded to quickly. It's a great example of a responsive organization. And why does this matter to you again? It matters to you because technology alone is going to be inadequate in the years to come to fuel competitiveness in our organizations. Inadequate. Technology will be the basis by which all of the innovation happens, but it will require more than just understanding the technology. It will require understanding these shifts and trying to figure out how your organization can take advantage of them. So what we did is, again, we looked across all of what was being talked about and the shifts we saw in companies, our customers, and we came up with these 4 core themes, these 4 core shifts that described how companies were changing. And we're going to go through them quickly today with some examples. The first shift is the one we talked about in the beginning, hierarchies to networks. Doesn't mean the end of hierarchy. It just means companies are trying to figure out how to work more like a network. So one of our customers is Nationwide. There was a gentleman and his family on vacation in Florida when their RV broke down. So he called his local insurance broker, who, customer service person again, said, no, you're not covered, I don't know how to help you. But the gentleman didn't give up. He called Nationwide, which is, again, his sort of the larger insurance carrier. Customer service person answered, also didn't have the answer, but didn't give up, decided not to just escalate or pass him along. Posted a question to their internal Yammer network. And people from across the org, from the products group, from the claims group, got involved to help that customer service rep. They were working across organizational boundaries. And in this way, they found that the customer was actually covered, even though it was a complex situation. They even figured out how to get them emergency funds. Now, I recently heard more about this story, actually. That customer service group, which was using Yammer, because their conversations were open, the senior leadership of the company was able to take feedback and actually change the performance metrics of the customer service group so they could have better customer service. And now they've instituted a program where a set of a couple hundred frontline customer service reps have a direct line with senior management so they can exchange information, collapsing those organizational boundaries. That's the example of working like a network. So what do we mean? We mean the company is so broken up with people across divisions, high and low. How do we collapse the distances between the people that make decisions and the people those decisions impact? How do we bring the customers in through those frontline employees? Because what companies are realizing is, again, the world formed a giant network, and it takes a network to serve a network. Of course, this explains a little bit about why I'm here talking about this. Yammer is a communication tool built as a network. The whole purpose of Yammer is that it is network-based communication for the purpose of being able to open up conversations, collaboration, so that we can use things like the Office Graph, as you heard today, to help you discover things that can help you do your job you may not have known about. It's what can help collapse organizational boundaries so that people can work like a network. The second big shift is what we call from control to empower. And again, to understand this one, we have to think back again to the way we built companies. Most workers were manufacturing. They were doing routine work. We didn't want them to be creative. We gave them simple metrics. We told them what to do, and if they did the right thing, they were rewarded. But now we don't know what happens when the targets are moving too quickly. What happens when you can't tell them exactly what to do? Suddenly, you have to empower employees to be creative on their own. And companies are beginning to realize this, but they also sometimes give mixed messages. Like, we want you to experiment, but then they punish failure. Qantas, I'm sure we've all heard of or flown, hopefully, is a big airline, obviously based out of Australia. And they, again, began using Yammer to help communicate across their organizational boundaries. The people on the planes can communicate now with the people on the ground. That sounds crazy, but they've never been able to do that before. So there was one example where one of the passengers complained about one of the menu items. And then next day, another passenger complained about the same menu item. And the flight crew, the people who worked on the plane, were able to communicate with each other and realize there was a pattern. And then communicated that pattern, again, on Yammer, to the people that provided the food. The menu was changed within 3 days of the first customer complaint. Now, that sounds like, of course it would be, but that never would have happened. There would have been no way, there literally was no way for the flight crew to talk to the people providing the menus. They were disconnected. It was just, here's the food, you serve it. And yet, because of that, they can talk about they can actually have better customer service. How many customers were going to get a meal that wasn't good and no one would have known about it? That costs real money. That's frontline employees making decisions that impact the revenue and the customer service of the business. All because they empowered those frontline employees to have a voice, to be able to speak about what they were doing and make decisions about it. The next shift is a little trickier, and in one of the more controversial ones, perhaps. And again, in order to understand this one, we have to, one more time, think back to companies as they were originally created. We did not want to empower employees, and we had a very simple way of motivating the right behavior. Carrots and sticks. We used reward and punishment. And it actually works. Reward and punishment, carrots and sticks, work if the outcomes are predictable. If you know exactly what you need people to do, then it's easy. Hit your target, you get paid. Don't hit your target, you don't. The problem is, what happens when the targets aren't predictable? What happens if between when the targets can be rewritten, between things change too quickly, and employees have to be empowered. How do we align motivation with what they need to do every day to serve our customers? So Daniel Pink writes about how to motivate this kind of behavior, to motivate non-routine work. What's required is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy to be able to make decisions. Mastery to be able to get better at what you're doing and feel like you have some ownership of it. And purpose because you can connect what you're doing to the larger purpose of the company. I'm sure many people here have shopped at Whole Foods. There's one close to my house. It's the only close shopping place that I go there all the time. And you get extraordinarily expensive salads. I love Whole Foods. One of the things that's made Whole Foods really unique is that they really, really encourage experimentation. They really encourage this idea that it's through teamwork and working together and experimenting that they're going to stay ahead and respond. And they make it part of their commitments, part of the way they reward is all about teamwork. And they tell people, we want you to experiment. You don't have to ask permission to do anything. One of the Whole Foods in California decided to open up a tap room, a beer hall in the middle of the store, basically. Didn't even tell headquarters, just decided to try it. Within a month, it was doing more revenue than the seafood department. And within, not long after that, now there's over 100 stores with tap rooms, all because of this local experimentation. We're seeing more and more of this. It was easy in the past when we just needed people to work harder. But when we need employees to work smarter, we're going to have to rethink how we motivate them. We're going to have to make sure that they have autonomy to be able to make decisions and experiment, and that they are connected to the deeper purpose of the company. Now, the final one is actually pretty easy, because in the beginning, we talked about how we're going to have to work like a network, because it takes a network to serve a network. Well, this one is a recognition that that network can't just be your employees. Your network that makes up your company includes your customers, includes your partners. And it's by working like a network, you can get fast enough feedback to respond with all of those groups. This example I just heard, this is so awesome. NAB is a bank in Australia, and they have been really pioneering new ways of working with their customers. Their customer service people use Yammer, talk to the rest of the company. They engage the entire company to try to solve problems in big Yam jams. Well, recently, they decided to start this new initiative called The Village. In a new building they built in Australia, they created a huge space where their customers can come and work at their office. They give them high-speed internet. They give them all the tools they would need so that they can partner with their customers. You want a new place to work that's kind of cool and nice? Work at our office. And then next to that, they created an external network so that the people who come together from a variety of customers can communicate with each other. Maybe they're working on similar problems. And suddenly, they have literally connected their customers as a network. They're not just working with their customers as a network. They're creating community. They've been extremely successful doing this. They're creating partnerships with their customers that are unlike much of what I've seen. Now, you'll notice something about all these examples. And just like I warned you in the beginning, I wasn't talking much about technology. None of these breakthroughs were about technology. Now, the technology enabled this. It wouldn't have been possible without the technology. But these companies took the technology further by working differently to take advantage of the technology in new ways. But here's the thing. I'm guessing that many people here are listening to this thinking, yeah, this is pretty abstract. There's a lot of good ideas. But perhaps you work for a company that just doesn't move very quickly, or it's just hard to get anyone to believe or try anything. You have great technology ideas, or you want to work differently, or there's teams that are political and don't want to work together. But what do you do when you can't move your company? So we have this really difficult problem today, which is, this whole talk we've been talking about how we run companies for a certain reason, because we've done it for 100 years this way. We're very successful doing it. This country, these companies, so successful doing things a specific way. And suddenly I'm up here saying it's not going to work in the future. Suddenly you're going to have to go to tell people, hey, the thing that made you successful isn't going to work. That's a tough pill to swallow. The harder part isn't people realizing that these changes need to happen. It's how do you convince others? How do you get your company to change? And so as we've looked across our customers and we've looked at the ones that have been successful at driving change, like NAB, the bank, like Nationwide, like Red Robin, so many examples, there's been a couple common elements that perhaps are counterintuitive. You see, companies tend to absorb change in similar ways. They tend to think big. Because in order to have any change happen, you have to have a big case. It has to be a big thing. And because it's big, it's dangerous. If it doesn't work, then you failed, and then people lose their jobs. And so that's one of the reasons this tends to get stifled. Companies tend to think everyone has to agree in order to even begin changing. And so within a lot of our customers, I see champions running around trying to convince everybody, don't you see what's happening? We're going to have to work differently. And it doesn't work either. So what we found as a pattern is that the first thing is to start small. Start small. That sounds crazy in big companies. It's so hard to do. But small means iterative. Small means you can have wins. You can try and succeed. But it's not just about starting small. It's about not even bothering to try to convince anyone about the need to change. It's about just finding the people that already agree. There's this theory of argument that I actually learned about in Microsoft, which basically goes that when you're trying to convince a group of people of something, that there's three kinds of people that you'll try to convince. There's red dots, yellow dots, and green dots. Has anyone heard this before? A couple people. So the red dots are people you'll never convince. The yellow dots are people that are on the fence. And the green dots already agree. And the argument goes that most people waste all of their time trying to create an argument and convince the red dots when they really should be focused on the yellow. Well, what I've seen in the majority of companies today is that you don't even have to worry about the yellow because there's enough greens throughout the company. There's already people who agree. There's already people who need a voice. For example, at NAB or at Nationwide, the customer service department was so frustrated that nobody was listening to them. They were green dots. They were ready to try new things. They were frontline employees. Finding small things with those people that already agree and doing things that matter to the company. One of the other mistakes I've seen is sort of this side approach, saying, let's try fun things to try to get people connected. Those are actually really good, to try contests and those, but it has to matter. Otherwise, people won't translate the success that you've shown into something that matters for the business. So, for example, Rio Tinto is an example. They decided to have a cost-cutting initiative, $5 billion over some years, and they decided to use Yammer to engage their globally distributed company to try to work on that problem. Well, people from across the company came together to realize they had different contracts with the same vendors, with different terms, different equipment, had different efficiencies. It was a pretty easy challenge to send that was low risk. And yet, because it was successful, it mattered to the company. Who doesn't care about cost savings? And yet they learned that they were working together well. There were so many other examples of Red Robin was another one with a similar story where he asked for a cost savings idea, or Red Robin engaged their frontline employees to help them design a new burger. Well, those employees, again, never had a voice. They were interested, they were green dots. And in fact, the people who designed the burger wanted faster feedback. So that's about finding the green dots. And in fact, it's about not trying to convince anybody. It's just saying, hey, got this project, we're going to do it in this way. Let's go. It's an experiment. And I've learned this magical thing, and the people here from Yammer and Microsoft have probably learned this about me, which is when I want to diffuse a situation, when I have a crazy idea that I want to try, I say, it's just an experiment. It doesn't work? It's okay. It's just an experiment. And it's super powerful because it's not about, yes, you have to do this, or you have to do that. So it's about starting small with like-minded people on projects that matter. And I want to make this other point that everyone in every position can do something. That whether you're the CEO, like David Thodey from Telstra, who just every once in a while replies to someone's message on Yammer, or likes someone's message, or points someone in the right direction, doesn't even do it that much, but sends this signal about the importance of working together, asks opinions, holds yam jams. Whether you're a manager who looks at your team and says, let's work together differently, let's create a group and start communicating more openly with each other, or let's ask another group that we work with to come together with us to work differently. Or maybe you're someone on the front lines who deals with customers. How do you connect those customers back into the company? How do you make better relationships between your customers so that you can work like a network? Well, hopefully I've mildly convinced you that we are entering a bit of a new era today, where we went through a major revolution, the Industrial Revolution, that led then to the Information Revolution that got us to this incredible moment of today, where the technology has started to get ahead of us. And I hope you see that in order to be successful in the future, it is going to require questioning our beliefs, questioning the things that got us here today, working differently. And yet, again, the good news is that it's the companies and, in fact, the people who begin to figure this out now are at a significant advantage because we're at the beginning of this inflection point. We're at the beginning of this transformation. which means there's a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit, which means that small things you do to work differently, small ways you interact with your customers, you'll notice these stories weren't even that big. Those small things yield disproportionate results. But what is required is working differently. And what is required is taking action. So if you don't want to be disrupted, then you'll have to be the disruption yourself and take action. Thank you very much. You know, since I have some extra time, I'll take questions. I don't often do, so hopefully they're good. No, I'm just kidding. But I'll take some questions. There's some mics up in the front. You can ask me whatever you'd like about other stories or companies. Yell it out.
How would you comment how you would apply your same speech to public sector and government, where this is quite a tough challenge because of all the organizational problems?
The question's about how does this translate to the public sector? This is actually something I get asked about a lot, because when you think about responsiveness, we often think about the least responsive organizations, which are those in the public sector. Man, it's tough, but I'll tell you, I see a lot happening. It's amazing how many groups in the public sector are beginning to try things. You know, I wish I had all the examples, but there was I was just in the UK, and there were these teams across the government that were beginning to try to create communities to just communicate cross-government, which never happens, right? But I think all of this applies, but it's definitely going to take some leaders. Like I think about the head of the LA school district, who, I don't remember the name, but they were like, you know what? There's too many rules, I'm never going to get anything done, and just started making changes, put their job on the line and said, I'm just going to do what's right, and they've been very, very successful. The problem is, I think, the bravery to really go out of their comfort zone to become more responsive. Because government, again, in many ways, wasn't built to be responsive either. It was really built to be stable. I mean, that's sort of our history of the fact that we have governments that are stable is itself an impressive feat, and suddenly we need them to be more than stable. We need them to be responsive, which is why we see a lot of private sector taking over for a lot of what government did. Clinton obviously talked about the partnership between government and private sector. I'm going to give you a phenomenal example. It came out of there's a friend of mine who works for the Stewart Foundation, and she's involved in foster youth, and it's very hard to do anything with foster youth. And so they went to the governor of California and said, hey, every year everybody comes and asks you to hold on to the pocket of money that's allocated to them, and in which case we have money allocated to foster youth. We don't want it. Go ahead and put it back in the pool. All we want you to do is to mandate that schools publicly report how many foster youth they have and how they're doing. That's it. We don't even need the money. Just report on it. And by creating that transparency, they got more money than they ever did. Because suddenly it was out in the open, and the schools felt accountable. And the schools were coming out of the woodwork to say, we need help, because they realized they had problems. They kind of worked with the system, played with the system, to make the system more responsive, just by creating transparency, without asking for more. And it was sort of this really interesting secret way. So I see stuff like that all the time. In fact, there's one suggestion for government is that if you want to create accountability, create transparency. And if there's one button that we can push and probably move, it's that one. Any other questions? Way over there? Questions, how do you deal with red dots? I try not to. No, I'm just kidding. It's really hard. I mean, that's where the way you deal with red dots is not trying to convince them. Because the more you push them, the harder they hold on. The way you convince red dots is, A, just do it. There's one of my favorite phrases I heard just recently, which is, many things are easier done than said. You know, we spend a lot of time trying to argue about how to do things or whatever. Sometimes you just do it. And who do you do it with? The green dots. You find the green dots, you do it, you prove it out. I've heard so many stories about that one manager or leader. Where was I? I was last week. I was at a big company. I can't remember who it was. And there was a senior executive who had said, this is a joke. I don't want to have anything to do with Yammer or any of this stuff. And a year later, she ran into him, and he was like telling everyone to use it. And what happened? Well, it took him time to see the changes himself. And so don't get caught up. Don't get hung up on the red dots. The red dot may be your boss. That's a tough situation. But you don't just work with your boss. You work with lots of people in your company. And there's lots of opportunities to work differently. Any other questions?
Yeah, 2 years after you've done all those experiments and you've got a Yammer instance, a chat,
That's a longer question, I guess. Technology is moving too quickly to spend too much time on reconciliation. Now, I think one of the things we're really excited about, and one of the reasons why we got acquired by Microsoft that we're excited about, is one of the fundamental problems with social, with Yammer today, is that it's separate. Is that you do your work over here, and then you have to go over here to have benefits that are social. We knew a long time ago that was going to be too slow. It was going to take too long to get people over there. So if you think about what was talked about today with the Office Graph, we believe that the real power is going to come by being where people are working. And I have this analogy of that, which was eye-opening for a lot of people. But before we had computers, we had information. It was on paper. We digitized the paper. We made it documents. And then we made it so we could send the documents back and forth over email. And then eventually we put those documents online where they were accessible to everybody. And then we created human-curated directories of that information, like Yahoo. But it wasn't until somebody figured out that you could create a graph of human activity so that when you surf the internet, you're benefiting everybody else, that information truly became discoverable. You didn't have to change your behavior. You were just doing what you were doing. You're benefiting everybody else. We have to bring that revolution to companies, where when I present a document to you, I'm actually benefiting other people who might be looking for that information. That if we worked in the same company and you were going to search for this, you would find this exact PowerPoint presentation because I presented it to you. Or you knew what information was valuable to the company because of how the company was using it. Hitting save on a file can be social collaboration if we can capture those signals and the intent of those. So I do think it's less about, you have to not think of today and all these different things. We have to figure out a way so that while you're using the tools you already use, we can capture that and make those tools more social. We can bring you information that'll help you do the job you're doing better in place. That's sort of where we think we're going, why we became part of Microsoft. Any other questions? We'll do two more, if there are two more. We have so much time. Over here. So the question is, they've got adoption of Yammer in their company, but some people are using it for work and some people are using it for other stuff. The short answer is, in the same respect that people use email for some for work for another, what makes it work? That it's sort of aligned to things you do at work. What we've seen time and time again is it's true that organically there will be some adoption of Yammer and there'll be some people that figure out how to use it for work, but that won't spread throughout the whole company unless you align it to actual things that matter to the company. Unless a group says, we're using it for this. This is the business process we're using it for. So for example, at Qantas, they began to say, all right, there are certain channels we're going to use Yammer for certain groups to communicate. And it wasn't a discussion about open collaboration and transparency. And it was just like, this is the tool we're using for that. By then, enough people had started to figure it out that it wasn't completely a surprise. So it is absolutely about engagement from managers and executives, aligning it to things that actually matter, sort of giving it purpose. Other than that, otherwise it will be used for other things, which is also powerful because people need to communicate and get to know each other. But to get the real value from it, to get more than that kind of value, it really takes aligning it to actual purpose. So let's take one last question, if there is any. Don't be shy. In the front. Okay. Yeah. 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 The question is sort of how to think about Yammer versus ERP competitor. Yeah. I just had this discussion actually just at lunch. Again, I think it comes down to this. We're in a weird situation. There's a lot of options, a lot of things to choose. But if you think about the direction that we're trying to go, we think that when you think about Yammer, don't think about it as Yammer. Yammer is one tool built on the Office Graph. The future of productivity is the graph, just like the future of information in our personal lives was the graph. We don't think of it that way, but that's what makes it so that we can find people and information. We're going to take Office and turn it into social, turn it into something built on the graph, so that when you open up and start working on a Word document, we can help you find information that will help you. and that we can embed those conversations and social commentary right there, and that those gestures are across all those applications. And then we're going to bring that to third-party applications as well, so that we can bring in all the information. I was just having this conversation. A year and a half ago, Yammer, just after the acquisition, Yammer had our own conference that we called Yam Jam. And we got on stage, and we were talking about the enterprise graph. And it's incredible to see that we're actually continuing on this mission. It's the mission we've been on the whole time. We realized about 2-3 years ago, I had the epiphany that, communication is just one piece of it. It's about the graph. It's about how we're going to capture social conversations and signals about people actually doing their work and then drive value back to those people. And so that's I think, the holy grail. And the reason why I feel optimistic about our success is because the majority of people and companies are using products that we build. And so we have a better opportunity to capture their intent and signals and what they're working on than almost anybody else. So hopefully that helps. All right, thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Oh, one other thing. If you're interested, we're having a little responsive org meetup tomorrow, Wednesday at 6:15 at the Ask the Experts session, social table, 6:15 p.m., 6 to 8. I'll be there. There'll be other people there just to chat about all this. Thank you very much.